Our theme for the month is fantasy, and to speak on behalf of fantasy and Oakland today, we have Courtney Martin. Courtney is an author and entrepreneur, and she's a column writer for On Being, which is an award-winning website, podcast, and radio show. She recently wrote a book, The New Better Off. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and she lives here in Oakland in a co-housing facility with her family called Temescal Commons. So without further ado, please welcome up on stage our speaker for today, Courtney Martin.
Thank you. Thanks all. Oh yeah, perfect, okay. I feel like you guys are in such a good place and I am going to depress you, but here's the deal. I have this book that came out, which I am going to talk a little bit about, but I also am in a very broken state because of last week. And so as I was leading up to this, and you know, we had talked about me speaking about fantasy months ago, and I was like, it'll be perfect. And then I was like, how about nightmare? Because that's actually what I'm feeling right now. So I decided I'm just going to show up in my real self to you all, because that's kind of my steez. And I wrote a new talk that I've never given that is about sort of the events of the last couple weeks in relationship to some of the stuff I've been thinking about for a much longer time. So is that cool with everybody? Yes? Okay. I have a feeling there's some of you in the audience who are also feeling pretty heartbroken. So I'm hoping that this will, I mean, there is hope in this. I don't want to make it sound so doomsday, but I do also want to be real about the moment we're all experiencing in this country. So, fantasy. Walter Lippmann says the way in which the world is imagined determines at any particular moment what men, and I added women, will do. So I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm a journalist by training, and Walter Lippmann was a journalist, and you know, thinking about the role of journalism in this moment and the role of storytelling and kind of how we got here. As I've been processing these election results, and as I said, quite frankly, being sort of destroyed by them, it made me pause and say, what is the world that I imagined? And here's what I realized upon reflection. My fantasy was that my daughters, 3 months and 3 years old, were going to grow up with their first conscious memory of presidential power being female. Hillary Clinton, admittedly flawed but deeply experienced politician and strategic thinker, was going to chip away at various badly needed reforms while doing a few bold things, like finally getting this country family leave policies worthy of its citizens and focusing on climate change with appropriate urgency. Okay, so that was my fantasy, however sort of subconscious. And so I started to think, what is the world that Trump supporters imagine? Part of me wants to guess at an answer. Maybe they imagined a world where Trump, a supposed outsider, shakes shit up. I heard that from some relatives. A world where people have been too timid to say what's real about the, quote, inner city, or Muslims or immigrants. A world where their own economic precarity is ended. I realize even as I say it that that's probably not particularly fair. Even though I grew up in Colorado Springs, which is sort of the home of evangelical Christianity, for those who don't know, and have a lot of Republican and religious conservatives in my extended family, I don't actually know many Trump supporters. I don't know what the world they imagine actually looks like. And therein lies the problem, or more accurately, problems. I wasn't fully conscious of my own fantasy, and I was and continue to be largely ignorant of the fantasies of those who live and think and vote unlike me. So I first started thinking about the importance of surfacing our own unconscious fantasies when I was working on my recently released book that I mentioned, and that Savio mentioned, The New Better Off, Reinventing the American Dream. I read a statistic that for the first time in history, the majority of American parents don't believe that their kids will be better off than they were. So when I read that statistic, I wasn't particularly sad. I was actually sort of puzzled by it. I thought it was kind of a provocation. Obviously, we've experienced economic recession, but on the other hand, what has better off ever really meant? And did our parents actually live better off in the way that they might have thought they did? So if I were to put this out to you guys, what do you think are the current markers of the American dream? Sort of the traditional American dream, what do we measure it based on? Any ideas? Just yell them out. Property, house, cars. 2.5 kids. Isn't that funny that that is the thing in everyone's head, mine included? 2.5 kids, property, the big house, The cars. What about job-wise?
Salary, title.
High salary, high status title. Job with retirement, et cetera. Okay, so we're all. This is what's interesting about fantasy, right? That in this regard, we all have a very, sort of cohesive idea, even though we all come into this room with lots of different experiences about what the American dream is supposed to be. So the traditional way we fantasized about succeeding in America is to work hard, climb the ladder, achieve status if you're a guy, be a nurturing, beautiful mother if you're a woman, buy a big house with a white picket fence, and have 2.5 well-behaved, high-achieving kids. In other words, to my mind, that is really boring and also not realistic. I can imagine that quite a few Trump supporters voted for him because they held this dream in their broken hearts. So I do have that in common, right? We're all a little brokenhearted. And they hadn't been able to achieve it. And rather than seeing that as an indicator that something is wrong with the dream itself, they saw it as something wrong with the government that is supposed to facilitate that dream. Trump is the archetype of status. A guy who puts his own name on skyscrapers, for God's sake. I'd like to propose that part of why this country was so vulnerable to Trump's messaging is because we haven't been brave enough to acknowledge that the traditional American dream is dead. Or that if it ever existed at all, it was built on the backs of people of color, immigrants, women, the very people that Trump took aim at throughout his campaign. I haven't seen a politician, progressive included, brave enough to say either of these two things. The dream is dead, that one we just summarized, and even when, if it was ever alive, it was morally corrupt. It sounds like a deeply depressing message. Of course, no politician seeking votes is going to say that. And yet, this is where I'm hoping to be a little bit uplifting, there is a hugely exciting invitation on the other side of that admission. If the dream is dead, and if it was morally corrupt in the first place, what might we create in its place? What are we already creating in its place that we don't even realize is vital? That's what I asked as I reported on and wrote this book. And here I just want to mention a couple of the cornerstones of the new fantasy that I found and am trying to live in my own life. The old Better Off, we talked about, the old American dream, was all about this secure, high status, high paying job, right? I believe that the new Better Off, a new fantasy that we could coalesce around, is to reinvent the social safety net and labor organizing in this increasingly fragmented economy, shore up our most reliable source of wealth, which is our relationships. So you all probably know, I'm sure many of you live this in this room, we now move jobs every 4.7 years on average. How many freelancers are in the room? Raise your hand. Okay, so that's actually representative, basically, of the American workforce. By 2020, nearly half of the workforce will be freelance. And even so-called traditional jobs have less and less robust benefit packages. So we still have this old mindset of thinking about, your parents are like, when are you going to get a good full-time job? And it's like, even the good full-time jobs often don't have the kind of benefits that generations past would have had. There's a sort of a false dichotomy between insecure freelance or good full-time job. Those things actually don't exist in the same way as they used to. So we need new systems, right? Our entire sort of social safety net system was created at a time when people did have those kinds of jobs. They don't exist anymore. So we need to operate with a different mentality within those systems if we're going to create dignified work for everyone. The good news is the people I get the most hope from around this, many of them live here in the Bay Area. Most of them are women, people like Jen Poo and the Domestic Workers Union, who figured out how you organize decentralized workers to get more dignity, to get decent wage, and actually not even take on their employers as these sort of evil symbols, but as allies in making that happen. If you want to see the cutting edge of dignity, look at the work they've done. There's also a bunch of people here in the Bay Area, Carmen Rojas, who does with the Worker Lab, and her whole crew who are reinventing labor organizing, Natalie Foster, who's trying to bring together unusual suspects to think about the gig economy. She helped found peers.org. So the good news is you're at the epicenter of some of the most cutting edge thinking, some of the most creative thinking about the future of work and dignity. That gives me a lot of hope. The other sort of old and new paradigm I want to give you is the first thing people said was property and houses, right? We really think about that. And 2008 was an important moment in this country because it basically was the moment where we realized the emperor had no clothes, right? So many people had mortgaged their own future on this symbol that then turned out to be kind of a delusion for a lot of people. So it used to be buy a big home with a white picket fence, get all your needs, physical and psychic, met within it by your nuclear family. The new better off, the new fantasy, is create broader communities of support and meaning and joy, acknowledge that the nuclear family is now a minority, and build policies and lives that support real families as they actually are. So I want to tell you a little bit about this in my life. This is right at 42nd and Telegraph. For those of you who hang out at like Arbor Cafe ever, we're sort of right around the corner. There's a bench there and a really prolific blackberry bush that a lot of people are like, oh, I stole blackberries from you. And I'm like, yeah, you're supposed to. So eat blackberries when you come by us. This is Temescal Commons, where I live and have lived for the past 4 years. It's a co-housing community. And co-housing basically just means that there's a bunch of people who own their own private homes, but also own some collective land together and gather in some way together. So our version of that is, from a logistical standpoint, there's about 25 of us, 12 units. We're intergenerational, interfaith. We gather every Thursday night and Sunday night to eat common meal together. So that means one of us, one family, cooks all the food. Everybody else just gets to come and eat it. And then on one Saturday a month, we do a work day together. So we meet in the morning, eat breakfast, and then figure out what needs to be done on the land and do it together. But we also have this broader commitment to what we call radical hospitality, the notion that anyone and everyone who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with kindness and love. And the intergenerational aspect is especially important because all of us are at different places in our lives needing different things. As you saw, I'm in that crazy moment of having 2 little maniacs. So I deeply rely on some of the parents in the community who have older kids. Their teenagers babysit my kids. I mentor them to try to get into college. Louise, my 78-year-old neighbor, who anyone who knows me knows because she's my favorite person on earth, is the garden guru. So she and my daughter plant carrots together. And I rely on her for the long perspective in moments like this when I feel like the world is ending. That's the sort of more amorphous but important way in which we interact. And one of the things that's really important about this, and I'm sure many of you in this room have incredible communities that you've painstakingly created, is the proximity, right? I don't know if any of you are like me, but I often have moments when I'm really struggling and I'll just like have my cell phone out, like staring at it, thinking like, who do I call? Who do I call? Who do I call? Like, Megan's super busy. She has her own kids and she's trying to get to work and like manage her life. I don't want to burden my mom with this because it's going to worry her too much. So we often have these moments when it's just hard to reach out. It's hard to know who to actually call. And the proximity of this means if I walk out into the courtyard, Louise and I are smacking into each other and I'm like, Louise, I'm not doing so good. And she's like, all right, let's take 2 seconds. Let me give you a hug, So I really want to emphasize how important I think the proximity is in what we've created. Here's a couple more pictures. This is the common house that we share. It's an industrial-sized kitchen and eating area where we have these common meals. And this is just kind of common meal in action. Another really interesting thing about this in relationship to the election is we are, as I mentioned, interfaith. We are not all Clinton supporters. You obviously know by now I am. And leading up to the election, we did a gathering where we all talked about the local ballot measures in particular. And really, it was really nerdy. We each said, okay, I'm gonna come and present these 2, and you present those 2, and we got together and we had arguments about it. We all felt quite differently about the ballot measures. And I've never felt so informed going into a ballot box in my life. I was really scared of that conversation. I was like, I don't want to get in a fight with Tom about stuff, I know we think differently about this, and instead it was a very alive and spirited but important experience for me of what it actually means to engage my citizenship rather than saying I'm a progressive, so I'm just going to vote for what I see some guide told me to vote for. It was I really understood the issues, and I complicated a lot of my thoughts. I probably voted in the same way I would have, but there were things that I knew were very imperfect, whereas I wouldn't have known that leading up to it. So there is research that people who live in communities like this are more politically engaged. Inherently, you have people who hopefully are not exactly like you politically that you can kind of rub up against and talk things out with. The other important thing I want to emphasize is about the family aspect of it. One of the delusions in this country that we uphold very dearly is this nuclear family notion. And it's kind of ironic for me to put this out there because I'm one of the minority of families that actually looks like that. I have a husband and 2 kids. We're married. We're white. All these things that we hold up as normal are actually not normal at all. So I'm very clear about that. And even even within that quote-unquote normal family, we have this delusion about husband and wife being able to meet all of each other's needs, right? Esther Perel writes really beautifully about this if you haven't seen her work, that things we used to rely on a village for in terms of our emotional, psychic shoring up, we now look to one person who is clearly never going to be able to do that. So one of the things that happens in co-housing is there's just less pressure on, you know, marriage relationships or partner relationships. There's less pressure on parents because you have what Bell Hooks called revolutionary parenting, which is that a bunch of people in the community are all looking out for each other's kids, including people who've never had kids who get a chance to parent a little bit, which is the case in our community. So there's just, I cannot speak enough about this as a fantasy that I am living, not to say it's not hard, right? Anytime you get a group of people together, there's hard stuff that goes on, but one that I want for more people. This movement has existed in America for 25 years, and there are only 160 in America, which is just crazy. So there's a lot of work to be done around structural rethinking of finances. You know, group process is always going to be hard, but especially as we have, you know, the so-called silver tsunami coming. Like, these co-housing communities are an incredible way to think about older people aging with dignity, aging in intergenerational contexts. Think about younger people getting the wisdom of those older people. Think about working families not being so under the gun all the time to meet all their own needs all by themselves. So, can't say enough about this. Gloria Steinem has said, dreaming is a form of planning, which means you have to be careful what you dream, where your dreams come from, how healthy, realizable, just they really are. You might accidentally be planning for a life that won't actually make you happy or healthy, or that isn't even possible, a sure recipe for bitterness. In these dark days, in what feels like a nightmare, I invite all of us to wake the fuck up. Sorry, bad language. There's an awesome little girl here, which I'm so excited about. Wake up to the unconscious fantasies about your own success that you're letting guide your decisions, your votes, yes, but also your decisions about what you spend money and attention on, what you spend time with, who you spend time with, how you feel about yourself. If you think you're a failure, I've got some good news for you. You might be a success by standards you haven't yet honored. Maybe you're a mediocre earner, but a masterful father. Maybe you've never bought your dream home, but you host legendary neighborhood parties. Now, if you're one of those textbook successes, the implications are potentially more grim. I think this is true of a lot of progressive people who were totally surprised by these election results. You might be failing by standards you hold dear, but that the world doesn't reward. Only you can know. And here's where we've all failed. We haven't been talking honestly enough, broadly enough, about the fantasies at the center of our own lives. We need listening tours, not by politicians, but by progressives and conservatives on our fantasy lives. We need to ask, as civil rights leader Ruby Sales urged in her incredible conversation with On Being's Krista Tippett, which if you haven't listened to, you have to listen to. She said we need to ask, where does it hurt? Where does it hurt? But we also need to ask, what is your fantasy for your own life, for this country? For many of us in this room, the biggest danger is not failing to achieve the American dream. The biggest danger is achieving a dream you don't actually believe in, and leaving others behind in a way that is both morally repugnant and pragmatically dangerous. I'll leave you with this. This is Ursula K. Le Guin, who's a legendary fantasy writer. How many Ursula Le Guin fans in the house? Nice. She says, fantasy is not anti-rational, but para-rational. Not realistic, but surrealistic, a heightening of reality. In Freud's terminology, it employs primary, not secondary process thinking. It employs archetypes which, as Jung warned us, are dangerous things. Remember the archetype I mentioned of the skyscraper with the dude's name on it? Fantasy is nearer to poetry, to mysticism, and to insanity than naturalistic fiction is. It is wilderness, and those who go there should not feel too safe. We aren't safe now. I would argue that we haven't been for a long time, especially people of color and women in this country. But we're really all aware of how unsafe we are now. But let's not strive for safety. Let's strive to be awake. Let's strive to be in uncomfortable conversations. Let's strive to heal. Let's strive to construct a fantasy about what this country can be that is so sober and vivid and inclusive and gorgeous that no one can trick us into giving it away ever again. Thank you.